I would like to start with welcoming listeners to this podcast. My name is Jolanda Jetten. I'm the co-editor of the British Journal of Social Psychology, and I edit this journal with Professor John Dixon, who's at the Open University. In this podcast, we'll be discussing one of our so-called landmark articles that will be published in the British Journal of Social Psychology as the first paper in the first issue of this year. So I'm talking about the March issue of BJSP. A couple of years ago, we started the Landmark series, and the idea was to invite eminent social psychologists to reflect on the big issues that our field is trying to address. And what we do is we encourage these experts to write freely about where the discipline is going or where they think it should be going, and we give them more freedom than all of us normally get to talk about topics social psychologists should be looking at. I'm pleased to say that we have with us today Professor Jack Dovidio, who's Professor of Psychology at Yale University. And Professor Dovidio has written our latest landmark article, and the title of his paper is Bridging Intragroup Processes and Intergroup Relations, Needing the Twain to Meet. This article starts with the observation that research examining relationships between groups, so research looking at, say, intergroup conflict or contact, that type of research has actually developed quite separately from work that has looked at intergroup processes, so the dynamics within groups. And this is quite unfortunate because, as Jack argues, so much can actually be learned from looking at the interplay between the processes between and within groups. And in this interview with him, I would like to explore these issues in greater detail. So let me start with the first question, Jack. Your paper starts with the observation, and I quote from your paper, you say, despite their shared focus on groups, research bridging intra-group processes and intergroup relations is surprisingly rare. I was just wondering if you want to elaborate a bit on why you think there has not been a greater integration of these two fields of research.
Well, that's really the question that stimulated me writing this paper. Although I won't say this paper really answers that question fully. It's not really about the history of psychology. But what struck me a number of years ago is I put together a pre-conference where I had people doing work on group processes present within group processes and intergroup processes. And I was struck by the ignorance we had of each other's work, even the bodies of work that existed. And so that's really what prompted me to really think about why this would occur. And the best answer I have to this is that around the 1940s and 1950s, probably punctuated by the classic work of Sharif on the robbers' cage study, where he looked at two groups of boys cooperating and competing with one another, there was an opportunity to integrate these fields. But I think what happened after that is intergroup research became very individualistic. We began to look at social cognition. So North American psychology pushed it in a very individualistic way, where we looked at within individual processes and almost abandoned the group. By the time we got to the 1970s, with a revolution suggested by Henri Tajfeld's work on social identity theory, that work even moved us further in this direction, I think, because it made very popular the minimal group paradigm, which is a research method where you try to strip groups of any real meaning and try to break it down to mainly different social categorizations of my preference for one artist versus your preference for another artist. And whereas the minimal group paradigm has been revolutionary for people doing work on intergroup processes, it essentially ignores within group processes because that's its basic goal. And so I think the fields just began to diverge in ways that led us to different literatures and moved us further and further apart over the years.
In your paper, you make a compelling case for why it is so important to study the way that these intergroup processes and intragroup processes relate to each other and also inform each other. I was wondering if you can say a bit more why it is so important in your view to integrate these two fields of research. So to put it differently, what is the value of such an integration, and how do you think it can actually advance our understanding of group processes more generally?
Well, group processes are not simply multifaceted, but those different facets are highly connected to one another. I want to just give you a simple example of how basic this is to the way we function. If you've ever been in the past at for example, a scary movie with a partner of yours, and often you just reach over and touch each other's hand during the movie, that somehow that external force has an important and fundamental impact on your relationship together in that context. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you think about other situations, how you experience events depend upon who you're with at that time. So it seems obvious in many ways that intergroup processes, the threats that we see about other groups, the nature of our relationship with other groups is going to shape how we relate to people who are close to us within group processes. Mm-hmm. And within group processes is going to determine an awful lot about how we feel about members of other groups. So as I'm trying to develop a connection and allegiance and inclusion in one group, I often will automatically try to show my rejection of other groups to achieve that goal. And so these things occur spontaneously, fundamentally, in everyday life, and yet our research hasn't really captured that complexity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you want to capture that complexity, then I was wondering what are the bigger points that you would want the listeners to think of, and how can they actually use these insights then to inform their own research on group processes?
Well, I think, one of the things we have to do in the research as researchers is reduce things to simple problems and simple questions. So we often will take snapshots of intergroup relations and look at those snapshots to understand how the dynamics of intergroup processes, how groups relate to one another. And I think we've done a great job of that. I think the field has done a really comprehensive job of understanding motivational and cognitive factors at any point in time that can affect the way we think about members of our own group and the way we think about members of other groups. Mm-hmm. I think what we have to do is develop more complex and more dynamic kinds of paradigms where we look at how the way I think about members of another group varies based on my relationship to members of my own group over time or under different circumstances. So I think we have to build more complex paradigms. We have to ask our questions a little bit broader and in a more comprehensive way. And we have to think about not the individual in the absence of others, but really how those interrelationships go back and forth with one another. And that makes it harder because you're looking at two directions of causality and how these happen iteratively. And that's a very different paradigm than what we typically do in social psychology, which is often cross-sectional, brief interactions with one another that are not extended over time.
Mm-hmm. So if you talk about the complexity of the paradigms that we need to develop, I wonder then, and this is also something you talk about in your paper, what kind of challenges and difficulties do we face then? And in particular, I was wondering if you can say a little bit about how you actually address these challenges and difficulties of doing this type of research, and how you actually tackle them in your own research.
Well, let me begin with the latter question there, how I've tackled it in my own research, and admit that I've done it without the depth that I wish I had. So much of the work that I did with Sim Gertner on the common in-group identity model, what we did was before we had any kind of intergroup contact, we had groups work together separately. And we did this with a real understanding that groups need to develop an identity, need to develop a sense of groupness, need to develop a sense of leadership and coordination. And then we basically brought these groups together to look at, and that's when we had our manipulations about under what conditions when they come together will they show conflict or cooperation with one another? Will their intergroup attitudes become better or become worse? But what we did is we had a very rich moment to look at what the dynamics were within each group to see how that plays out in terms of the intergroup. And in reality, we never really followed up on that in order to really capitalize and exploit all the data that we had. We're not the only ones. In that Sharif Roberts Cave study, which again is a classic study, if you read the original book, there's a whole chapter devoted to what they did to allow the groups to be separate and not know about the existence of other groups, with this presumption that it's going to do something to the identity of each group. It's going to do something with the processes. And what happened with those group processes, Sharif even suggests was going to be essential, the prerequisite to intergroup conflict. And yet he never says anything after that chapter about what happened. It just seems that we've treated it too much like a preliminary stage rather than something worthy of study in its own right. So you asked me how I've done in my own research, and I would say not as good as I should have. And now looking back, it's actually prompted me to go back to data that's 20 years old to see if I can reconstruct anything interesting. But I just didn't have the foresight back then to do it. So it means that, particularly at an age where we're doing a lot more work on the internet and not face-to-face interaction, we have to think about new paradigms that will capture the dynamics of how we relate to one another, and then look at that reciprocal relationship. And like I said, we tended to look at it only in a unidirectional way. I looked at one as either a nuisance or as a prerequisite to the other, but never really looking at it in terms of the interrelationship. I would say, that there are new theoretical developments that I think can really capture this. Self-categorization theory is probably the best theory that I know of that really begins to look and can be applied to both within group processes, who becomes the leader, and how that leader influences the group, but also intergroup processes simultaneously. And so I think that we do have some theoretical tools that we can begin to work from, but I think that we have to develop the paradigms and the will to do it, rather than continuing to go on in mutual ignorance.
Okay. Just one thought I had while I was reading your paper is that I was thinking that when we take account of the complex ways in which actually these within group processes and between group processes relate to each other, that it may actually lead us to question the extent to which effects are universal and the extent to which you can generalize effects to other group contexts. So just to give an example, so in that sense, what you are doing then is that all groups are unique because they differ in their group history and the development stage and their structure. That should then also mean that even when confronted with the same, say, intergroup threats, that every group would respond in a different way. I would be interested to know whether you think it's that a better appreciation of this complex interplay between intra and intergroup processes also limits the extent to which we can actually generalize findings from one group context to the next.
Yeah, we can think about, so I'll give you the two sides of this. Yes, the simple answer to your question is I do think it limits the generalizability of some of our work to different intergroup contexts. The flip side of that is it enhances our appreciation of and maybe recognition of new factors that moderate these processes that we should be considering to understand what the limits of the processes we've identified are and how far we can push them. For example, recently I was looking at some work on prejudice in different cultures. And the question, a simple question was working on a paper got this idea to start writing a paper on are members of different cultures differentially prejudiced in terms of both degree and the groups to which they are biased against, the groups to which they stigmatize. And again, there's a literature out there, but it's not a big literature. It's not a cohesive literature. It's scattered around cross-cultural literature, cultural psychology, a little bit in intergroup. And when we looked at those data, what we found was there were very big differences between, say, North American and Western European kinds of cultures, individualistic cultures, meritocracy-based cultures versus East Asian cultures, in terms of which were much more collectivistic in many ways. And so the basic nature of the culture was determining the degree of bias they had towards many different groups, towards homosexuals versus immigrants, towards trying to think other groups, members of other racial groups, to drug addicts, were fundamentally different in collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. And what I would argue is that would be, the reason that's the case is in collectivistic cultures, the within group relationships are fundamentally different than they are in individualistic cultures. The way people relate to one another as a group, as a society, as a culture differs. And because of that, it's going to shape who they see as an in-group member, who they see as an out-group member, who they see as threatening. It affects the perception of the homogeneity and the prototype of the in-group and the way the other groups are seen and responded to. So, yes, I think that maybe a recognition that most of the time we look at these processes, intergroup processes, and we believe them to be universal. And in fact, when we see any variation in that, we consider that our error variance. What I'm suggesting is that geography is important, culture is important, stages of group development are important, and if we stop looking at them as error variance, as things we can't explain, or as nuisances to our emphasis to make universal conclusions, what we might find is some really interesting, important, valuable, both theoretically and practically, moderators of the effects that we've been talking about for so long. And so much of the work in psychology historically has come from North America and Western Europe, that the similarity of those cultures may obscure us from seeing really the variety of processes that go on in other cultures.
Mm-hmm. You already touched upon the next question, actually, in response to some of my earlier questions, but I'd still like to ask it. And the question is really, how do you think future research might address this issue of the interplay between intra and intergroup dynamics? Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think there's some very interesting opportunities. I mean, cross-cultural research is obviously one of the ways. I think an alternative way of thinking about this is to look at groups not so much in our conventional way, and I think we should continue to do work on face-to-face interaction. I think that we should continue to have paradigms where we bring groups together and see how they interact with one another as groups or as individuals. I think that's still the building block of our science. That's what social psychology is about. But at the same time, a number of years ago, I was talking to a colleague who studied virtual reality. And he was studying virtual reality at the time. It was, I would say, was kind of gimmickry. It was kind of a tool for social psychologists to play around with. And what social psychologists were doing with virtual reality was basically seeing if we could replicate basic social psychological findings, such as conformity or other processes, in virtual reality. But as he was talking, what he said is he realized that his work on virtual reality has gone from being on the periphery of social life to being very much at the center of social life. That so much of social life today is electronically mediated communication. It's about people interacting with each other in virtual realities. And I think that's just going to be the way our social life is going to grow. And so I think one of the ways we can move this research, and I think a really exciting way, is to really stop and recognize that virtual interactions between groups are going to be a more and more important part of our social life, and the dynamics of these virtual interactions, intergroup and intergroup interactions, are going to be perhaps very different from face-to-face interactions. They may develop much faster. They may have fewer inhibitions. They cut across boundaries of culture. They involve the development of subcultures very spontaneously within the larger culture. One of the findings that some people have done, some preliminary findings on hate groups, is that the idea of being able to connect to each other in virtual reality allows people who have extreme views all over the world, who were previously isolated from one another and therefore deviant, to come together spontaneously and form a community and form a group. And by forming a true hate group in terms of electronic communications, allows that group to coalesce and develop intergroup relations towards other groups and act on that in ways that were unprecedented just a few years ago. So I think that what we can do, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's difficult to create interactions in the laboratory between groups of 10 people here and 10 people there. But what we can do is create these interactions on the internet, that we can intervene and run well-controlled experiments, drawing on many different types of people who are not easily accessible in subject pools. People who are more conservative, people who are more extreme, people who have different commitments in life to other people. And we can use this as really a fantastic tool to show how groups develop and how groups develop in the context of their relationships to other groups. And we can do this over time. So I think, we're really at a wonderful place in the field because we can take what we know about intergroup research and bring it across cultures, but bring it across cultures, across groups, across subcultures, virtually instantaneously, plus in a way that most researchers can afford. Not everybody will have access to subject pools of 2,000 people. Not everybody can pay subjects to come to experiments over and over again. But I think most everybody can begin to think about clever ways of expanding our science. And it will not only open up what we do theoretically, but I think it's going to have real practical importance in terms of shaping the future of people's social lives, which are becoming more and more virtual.
Mm-hmm. It's time for us to wrap up now, but before doing that, I would like to ask you, Jack, if you have any final thoughts you would like to share?
I hope that people don't see the paper that I wrote as being critical of the field. I think it's just the opposite. To me, it's looking at the opportunities that so much of the field has developed in a very specialized way that we sort of moved away from some of the productive conversations we can have with each other. And I think what I wanted to do is just remind us that we have colleagues close by. We have journals on group processes and intergroup relations and social psychology and group processes, and we have all the resources available to us. That specialization sometimes leads us to miss some of the important things that can tie us together. And so I hope, as people read it, they don't see it as me being grumpy and critical of the field, but rather just the opposite, saying that, you gave me this opportunity to write this article to sort of reflect back on a lot of things that I never have time to reflect on. And I'm hoping that if we stop and reflect on these things, that your journal, this article, can stimulate people to think in different ways that I think will be important, again, not only for the development of our theories to be much more comprehensive, to be much more inclusive, to be much more dynamic in terms of what we usually do. But I think that it'll allow us to really make a big difference in terms of the way groups actually relate in the future. and the way our societies will actually be functioning today and tomorrow as well.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. In particular, I want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to do this podcast and to talk about your work. I also just want to remind readers that this paper titled Bridging Intragroup Processes and Intergroup Relations, Never the Twain Will Meet, will appear in the BJSD March edition, and it is being made available free to all of our readers. I strongly recommend that you take the time to read it, and I would like to thank you for listening to this podcast.